In the dead of winter 1877, in a part of the Dakota Territory so unforgiving it felt like God had turned his back on it, a lone woman stood at a crossroads, a choice that would pour gasoline on a flickering ember and set her entire world on fire. Her name was Sarah O'Connell, a widow, and all she had left to her name was a one-room cabin and a silence so deep it had started to grow teeth. She was standing on the edge of a frozen pond, a place called Miller's Pond. Though no miller had lived there for a decade, she was just checking her trap lines, a ritual that had more to do with fighting off the ghosts in her head than it did with catching furs. And that's when she saw it. A splash of crimson, a smear of impossible color against a world of just black and white. It was a wound in the landscape itself, a bloody stain spreading across the ice like a secret trying to get out. Her first thought was a deer. A wounded animal would mean meat, food, survival. Practicality was the armor she wore against the fear that was always clawing at the door. But as she got closer, clutching the old Winchester rifle that had belonged to her husband Liam, the shape resolved itself. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't an animal at all. It was a boy, a Lakota boy, no older than 12, half submerged in a jagged hole in the ice. He was bleeding and he was dying. And in that moment, Sarah O'Connell made a choice. The kind of choice that splits a life in two. The before and the after. She dragged him from that frozen water, an act of mercy. But in that time and in that place, mercy had a price paid in blood and fire. By sunset, they came for him, his tribe, and the darkness that fell around her little cabin wasn't pushed back by starlight. It was pushed back by the silent, judging flames of 100 vigil fires, ringing her home in a perfect circle of death. She had saved a life, and in doing so, she had just signed her own death warrant. The cold in the Black Hills that January wasn't just a temperature on a thermometer. It was a living thing, a predator. It seeped through the chinking of Sarah O'Connell's cabin. It leached the warmth from the floorboards, and it painted the single pane of glass with beautiful, intricate lies of a forest that wasn't really there. For 2 years, ever since pneumonia had stolen her husband Liam, and left her in this profound silence, Sarah had learned the language of this cold. She knew its biting whisper in the pre-dawn hours and its weary sigh as the sun bled out behind the western peaks. This land didn't care if you lived or died. It was a fact she had come to accept. You either fought or you were swallowed whole. Her breath plumed in thick white clouds, the only soft thing in a world of hard edges. Flinty rock, frozen earth, and the skeletal remains of aspen trees that looked like bony fingers reaching for a bruised, indifferent sky. That's when she saw it, that smear of unnatural color against the stark white canvas of Miller's Pond. It wasn't the dull rust brown of a fox caught in one of her traps. It was a vivid, shocking crimson, a splash of violence on the otherwise serene, ice-locked water. Her heart, which usually beat a slow and steady rhythm against her ribs, quickened its pace. It hammered a frantic message against her bones. Danger. She clutched the stock of Liam's old Winchester, its wood worn smooth by his hands and now hers, and crunched her way toward the edge of the pond. The snow was deep, sinking past the tops of her worn leather boots with every step. Her first thought, her first hope, was a wounded deer. Game was scarce, and a deer would mean weeks of salted meat. Practicality was the armor she wore against the cold, gnawing fear that was never far away. As she drew closer, the shape resolved itself. The knot of hope in her stomach turned to ice. It wasn't a deer. It was human, and it was small. Children didn't wander this far out. The nearest settlement, the ramshackle mining town of Redemption Gulch, was a hard 10-mile ride away. A place full of hard men with harder eyes, all chasing rumors of gold and drinking away their failures. No settler family lived within shouting distance of her cabin, which meant only one thing. Sarah crept to the very edge of the ice. A boy, no older than 12 or 13, lay half in, half out of a jagged hole where the ice had given way. He was Lakota. His face, serene and pale, was framed by long black hair that was already beginning to freeze to the surface of the pond, like strands of black glass. He wore hide leggings and a simple tunic, now soaked and dark with freezing water. The blood she saw now wasn't from the fall. It originated from a dark, ragged tear in his left shoulder, staining the ice in a gruesome halo around him. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at her. Her mind, her survival instinct, screamed at her to turn back. This is not your fight. This is not your trouble. Bringing a wounded Lakota boy into her home was an invitation for a kind of chaos she couldn't possibly handle. The tensions in the territory were a powder keg waiting for a spark. Just a year ago, the news of Custer's defeat at the Little Bighorn had sent waves of terror and rage through settlements like Redemption Gulch. The Lakota were seen not as people, but as a hostile force, a specter of violence haunting the hills. To be found with one of their own, wounded, dying, could be a death sentence from either side. The settlers would call her a traitor and hang her from the nearest tree. The Lakota would assume she was the one who hurt him and answer with a vengeance that was the stuff of nightmares. She looked at his face again. He was just a child. His lips were blue, his skin the color of ash. In the stillness of his features, she saw not an enemy, but the ghost of the son she and Liam had always dreamed of having, a dream they had buried right alongside him. "Damn it all to hell," she whispered, the curse swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. She laid the Winchester down in the snow. Testing the ice near the edge with her boot, she found it thick enough, but near the boy it was a fragile spiderweb of cracks. She couldn't risk walking out to him. Lying flat on her stomach, Sarah distributed her weight and began to crawl. The intense cold of the ice seeped instantly through her woolen coat, stealing her breath. The wind picked up, a high, mournful keen that whipped loose snow into her eyes, blinding her. "All right, son," she grunted, her voice strained as she reached him. "Let's get you out of this." His skin was shockingly cold, his body limp. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of waterlogged hide and freezing flesh. She hooked her arms under his, her fingers clumsy and numb with cold, and pulled. The ice groaned in protest. For a terrifying moment, she felt it sag beneath her, and the dark, frigid water lapped at the edges of the hole. She pulled harder, her muscles screaming, her teeth gritted against the pain and the cold. The boy's body scraped against the jagged edge of the ice, and a soft, barely audible moan escaped his lips. He was alive. That knowledge gave her a surge of desperate strength. With a final guttural heave, she dragged him free of the water and onto the solid ice. She didn't rest. Scrambling backward, she pulled him by the shoulders, his soaked leggings leaving a dark trail behind them until they were both back on the snowy bank. Getting him to the cabin was a new agony. He was 100 pounds of dead weight, and she was a woman worn thin by grief and hard living. The half-mile to her cabin, a walk she did every day, became an eternity. The snow fought her, the trees seemed to close in, and the silence of the woods felt like a held breath, a witness to her folly. By the time she reached the rough-hewn porch of her cabin, sweat was freezing on her brow, and her lungs burned with every gasp of frigid air. With the last of her strength, she hauled him inside and slammed the door, shutting out the accusing white world. She bolted it, as if that could keep the consequences out. She had just dragged the fuse of a powder keg into her home, and outside, unseen, someone had just lit the match. The cabin was a single room, dominated by a stone fireplace and a narrow cot. It was her entire world. She dragged the boy to the bearskin rug before the hearth, his wet clothes pooling dark water on the wood. Her hands shook, but her mind was suddenly, terrifyingly clear. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Liam had taught her a thing or two about wounds, his lessons learned on battlefields she could only imagine. Now this tiny cabin was her battlefield. She stoked the fire, piling on logs until it roared to life, casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls. Then with a knife she kept honed sharp for skinning rabbits. She carefully cut away his tunic. The wound was worse than she'd feared. It was a ragged, ugly gash deep in the muscle of his shoulder. This wasn't a knife wound, it wasn't an arrow. It was a bullet hole. A graze, maybe, but a deep one. Someone had shot this child. She worked quickly, her actions methodical. She boiled water, sterilized a needle and thread with whiskey, and tore strips from one of her few clean linen shirts for bandages. She cleaned the wound as best she could with the whiskey, earning a pained hiss from the boy, his first real sound. His eyes, dark and delirious with fever, fluttered open for a second. They were filled with a terror that cut right through her. Toka, he whispered, a dry, rasping sound. Enemy. Shh, she soothed, her voice softer than she'd intended. You're safe now. Just rest. She didn't know if he understood her words, but he seemed to respond to the tone. His eyes slid shut again. As she began to stitch the torn flesh together, her fingers deft despite their trembling, she noticed something tucked inside his waistband. It was a small, crudely carved wooden falcon, its wings outstretched. A talisman, maybe. Or his name. She finished her work, bandaging the wound tightly. She covered the boy with every spare blanket she owned, propping his head on a pillow filled with dried pine needles. He was still dangerously cold, his breathing shallow and fast. For hours she sat by his side, feeding the fire, wiping his brow with a damp cloth when the fever took hold, and listening. Listening to the wind howl outside, a sound that seemed to be mocking her. "What have you done, Sarah?" it seemed to whisper. "What have you done?" As the afternoon light began to fail, painting the snow-covered pines in hues of orange and purple, a new sound reached her. It was distant at first, a low, rhythmic thudding. It was not the wind. It was the sound of horses, many horses. Sarah rose and went to the window, peering through a small patch she'd cleared in the frost. Her blood ran cold. Descending from the ridge to the north, silhouetted against the dying sun, was a line of riders. Lakota warriors. They moved not with the haste of a search party, but with the grim, unhurried deliberation of a war party. They were not heading for Redemption Gulch. They were heading directly for her cabin, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic prisoner in her own chest. They knew. Somehow they knew she had their boy. She looked from the riders to the child, sleeping fitfully by her fire. She had pulled him from the ice to save his life. Now as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into a deep, cold purple, she realized she may have just signed a death warrant for them both. The riders began to spread out, forming a wide, menacing circle around her isolated homestead. They were utterly silent. There were no shouts, no war cries, just this terrifying, methodical encirclement. And as the last light of day vanished, one by one, fires began to bloom in the darkness. The first one was lit directly in her line of sight, a sudden blossom of orange that pushed back the encroaching indigo of twilight. Then another, and another, until a score of them flickered to life, then 200, then more. 100 silent fires, a perfect, terrifying circle with her tiny cabin at its dead center. They were spaced with unnerving precision, each one a beacon of silent judgment in the vast, snowy dark. Sarah backed away from the window, her hand instinctively going to the cold metal of the Winchester leaning against the wall. The feel of it was a small, inadequate comfort. What could one rifle do against so many? They weren't attacking. They were waiting. And that was so much worse. A charge would have been chaos, a desperate, bloody fight for survival that would be over in minutes. This was a siege. It was psychological warfare. A slow, deliberate tightening of a noose made of fire and silence. Every shadow in the cabin became a threat. The wind whistling through the chimney no longer sounded like the wind. It sounded like a war cry being held just at the edge of hearing. The creak of the logs in the walls sounded like footsteps. She glanced at the boy. His breathing was a little easier, the fever flush on his cheeks less pronounced. She had saved him from the lake. But what had she delivered him to? And what about herself? The stories from Redemption Gulch flooded her mind. Lurid tales told over cheap whiskey in the saloon about Lakota vengeance, about what they did to settlers caught on their land. They were stories designed to stoke fear and hatred, and Sarah had always tried to dismiss them as drunken bravado from cowardly men. But now, with the firelight from 100 enemy camps dancing on her walls and the silent warriors just beyond her door, the stories felt chillingly, terrifyingly real. They had to believe she was the one who hurt him. It was the only thing that made sense. A white woman, a settler, found with a wounded Lakota child. The conclusion was simple, brutal, and wrong. She had to do something. She couldn't just wait for them to burn her out or storm the door. But what? Walk out there, hands raised, and try to explain? In a language she didn't speak, To people who had every reason to kill her on sight, it was suicide. Her gaze fell on the boy's wound again. The bullet. She hadn't found the slug itself when she was cleaning the wound. It must have passed clean through or was still lodged deep inside where she couldn't reach. But the entrance wound, it was blackened, scorched at the edges. A close-range shot. The tunic she'd cut from him lay in a heap by the fire. Driven by a desperate need for answers, for anything that could save her, she picked it up. The hide was still damp and smelled of lake water and blood. She examined the hole the bullet had made. It was small, consistent with a rifle round. As she ran her fingers over the material, she felt something hard and flat in a small pouch sewn into the lining. Her fingers, stiff with cold and fear, worked it open. Inside was a single spent shell casing. It was brass, tarnished, but the stamp on the bottom was still legible. 45 to 70 government, the standard round for the new Springfield rifles the Army used, and the rifle of choice for any man who fancied himself a serious hunter or a dangerous man. A common enough caliber, but it was a clue. But why would the boy be carrying a spent casing? Had he picked it up after he was shot? A souvenir of his own attempted murder? Her mind raced, connecting dots she hadn't even known existed. The boy had been found at Miller's Pond. Her pond. On her land. But the valley, this small stretch of meadow and wood, was coveted by another man. A man named Silas Croft. Croft had arrived a year ago with a wallet full of cash from some eastern inheritance and a poisonous belief that the Black Hills were his for the taking. He'd bought up claims around Redemption Gulch and was trying to consolidate the entire valley, pressuring smaller homesteaders like Sarah to sell. He saw her not as a neighbor, but as an obstacle. He'd made her several offers, each one more menacing than the last. "A woman alone has no business out here, Mrs. O'Connell," he'd said just a month ago, his smile thin and predatory. "This is a hard country. It needs a firm hand." Croft hunted obsessively. He and his two hired men, the gruff and cruel Miller brothers, were always prowling the woods. They hated the Lakota with a venomous passion, viewing them as little more than vermin to be cleared out. And Silas Croft's prized rifle, the one he boasted about constantly in town, the one he polished on the porch of the general store like a beloved pet, it was a brand new 45-70 Springfield trapdoor. A cold, terrible certainty began to settle over Sarah. Croft or his men had shot the boy. Perhaps they thought he was a spy, or maybe they just did it for sport. The boy, wounded, had run, eventually collapsing on the ice of her pond. This changed nothing about the 100 fires outside her door, but it changed everything inside her mind. This was no longer just a tragic accident. This was an attempted murder, and she was now harboring the only witness. The boy stirred, his eyes open. This time the delirium seemed to have receded, replaced by a clear, sharp fear. He stared at her, then at the firelight flickering on the ceiling. He tried to sit up, but winced and fell back, his hand going to his bandaged shoulder. "Easy," Sarah said softly, moving closer. She knelt beside him, keeping her movements slow and non-threatening. "You're safe. You're in my cabin." He stared at her, his dark eyes wide and searching. He didn't seem to understand her words. She pointed to herself. "Sarah." Then she pointed to him. "What's your name?" He remained silent, his gaze wary. He was scared of her. She remembered the wooden falcon. She picked it up from the mantelpiece where she'd placed it and held it out to him, his eyes fixed on it. A flicker of recognition, a sliver of trust. He reached out with his good hand and took it, his fingers closing around the worn wood. He looked at her again and then spoke one word, his voice a whisper. "Chatan." Falcon. A noise outside drew both their attentions. It was the sound of a single person approaching the cabin. Not the thunder of a charge, but the slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps in the snow. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. She grabbed the Winchester, her knuckles white. She moved to the door, pressing her ear against the rough-hewn planks. The footsteps stopped just outside. There was a long, heavy silence, pregnant with menace. Then a voice, deep and resonant, cut through the night. It spoke in Lakota, the words powerful and demanding. She didn't understand the words, but the meaning was crystal clear. Come out, or we are coming in. She looked at Chatan. His eyes were wide with a new kind of fear, but also something else. Recognition. He whispered a single word, one she had heard before, but this time with reverence. 8. Father. The man outside was the boy's father, the leader of the men by the fires. Sarah's hand trembled on the rifle. She was trapped between a grieving, powerful father who believed she had harmed his son and the terrible truth of a crime committed by a man who wanted her land. The ring of fire was no longer just a threat of violence from without. It was a crucible, and she was standing at its burning heart. The silence that followed the man's call was heavier than any sound. Sarah's mind spun, a frantic cyclone of impossible choices. If she opened the door holding a rifle, she'd be shot before she could utter a word. If she didn't open it, they would break it down, and the result would be the same. The boy, Chatton, was her only hope, her only possible proof of her innocence. But he was weak, feverish, and terrified. He was a witness, but he couldn't speak for her. Not yet. She made a decision. It felt like stepping off a cliff in the dark. She leaned the Winchester against the wall by the door, a gesture that cost her every ounce of self-preservation she possessed. She looked at Chatton, whose eyes were fixed on the door, and placed a finger to her own lips. Quiet. Then she pointed to him, into her own heart, and made a clumsy motion of helping. It was a pathetic attempt at sign language, a desperate prayer in motion. Taking a deep breath that did nothing to calm the frantic beating in her chest, she drew back the heavy iron bolt on the door. It slid with a groan that sounded impossibly loud in the charged silence. She pulled the door inward, just a crack, peering into the night. The man standing there was framed by the light of the nearest fire. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face a mask of hard lines and deep-set grief. He wore a heavy buffalo robe over his shoulders, and his long hair, streaked with gray, was held back by a simple leather band. His eyes, dark and piercing, locked onto hers with an intensity that stripped away all pretense. This was a man accustomed to command, a man hollowed out by fear for his son. This was a chief. He said nothing. He simply waited. His stillness was more intimidating than any threat. Behind him, Sarah could see the other warriors, motionless on their horses or standing by their fires, watching, an entire tribe holding its breath. Sarah opened the door wider, stepping back to show she was unarmed. She kept one hand held up, palm forward, in a universal gesture of peace. "He is here," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "He is alive." The man's gaze flickered past her into the warmth of the cabin, landing on the small form wrapped in blankets by the fire. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift occurred in his rigid posture. The iron mask of the chief cracked just enough to reveal the anguish of the father. He took a step forward, his eyes never leaving Chawton. Sarah stood her ground, a silent gatekeeper. She had to make him understand. "He was in the lake," she said, pointing toward the pond. "The ice. It broke. He is hurt. A gunshot." She pointed to her own shoulder, mimicking the wound. The man's eyes snapped back to her, sharp and suspicious again. He didn't understand all her words, but gunshot was a sound that transcended language. He barked a short, guttural question in Lakota. Sarah shook her head. "No, not me." She held up her hands, showing they were empty, clean. "I found him. I helped him." He took another step, crossing the threshold into her cabin. He moved with a fluid grace that belied his size. The scent of wood smoke, pine, and the cold night air entered with him. He ignored Sarah completely now, his entire being focused on his son. He knelt by Chatton's side, his large, weathered hand gently touching the boy's forehead. Chatton's eyes fluttered open. 8, he breathed, the word full of disbelief and relief. The chief murmured something soft in their language, a sound of profound tenderness that seemed utterly at odds with his formidable presence. Chatton responded, his voice weak, a few halting phrases. The chief's eyes then moved to the clean bandage on his son's shoulder, his fingers lightly tracing its edge. He looked at the stitches, the pot of boiled water still near the hearth, the strips of torn linen. He looked at the relative comfort and warmth of the scene. His gaze lifted and met Sarah's once more. The suspicion was still there, a hard kernel of doubt, but it was now mingled with something else. Confusion. The scene did not match the one he must have imagined. This was not the lair of a monster. This was a place of healing. He rose to his full height and spoke, his voice low but carrying the weight of authority. He used a mixture of Lakota and the broken English common in trade. He pointed to the fires outside. "Fires," he said, his hand making a circle. "Why you have my son?" This was the moment. Her life, and the fragile peace of this valley, depended on her next words. "I pulled him from the water," she repeated, speaking slowly, clearly. "He was freezing. He was bleeding." She paused, then made a decision that felt like another leap into the abyss. She walked to the heap of the boy's clothes and picked up the spent shell casing she had found. She held it out to the chief on her open palm. "This," she said, "from a rifle, not mine." The chief looked at the casing, then back at her. He didn't take it. His eyes narrowed. He seemed ready to pass judgment, to declare her a liar and an enemy. And then came the twist. Not a twist of the knife, but a turn of the entire world as Sarah understood it. "The fires," the chief said, his English slow, deliberate. "They are not for war." He looked at his son, his expression softening again into that of a worried father. "They are a prayer, a vigil. We watch over his spirit. We ask it to stay." Sarah stared at him, dumbfounded. The ring of fire, the symbol of her terror, the siege she had been enduring for hours, was a prayer circle. The menacing warriors were not executioners. They were family holding a vigil for a child hovering between the world of the living and the world of the spirits. The terror she had felt was a product of her own ignorance, her own fear, fed by the hateful stories she'd heard in town. They weren't surrounding her to condemn her. They were surrounding the son they loved. The realization washed over her, so potent it left her dizzy. "A vigil," she whispered, the words tasting foreign on her tongue. The chief nodded, a single sharp gesture. "I am Kangi Sapa, Black Crow. This is my son, Chotin." He finally took the shell casing from her hand, rolling it between his thumb and forefinger. 45-70. He knew the caliber. He looked at her, a long, calculating look. "You are the widow, O'Connell." He knew her name. Of course he did. They knew every settler in this valley, knew their habits, their weaknesses. "Yes," she said. "Why was my son on your land?" Kangisapa asked, the question sharp, direct. "I don't know," Sarah answered honestly. "I just found him on the ice." Chotin, who had been listening, spoke again from the cot, his voice a little stronger now. He uttered a few sentences in Lakota, his hand clutching the wooden falcon. Kangisapa listened intently, his face darkening with every word. He looked from his son to Sarah, then back. He spoke to Chotin again, a gentle question. Chotin answered with a single word. Kangisapa looked at Sarah and said the name like a curse. "Croft." He held up the shell casing. "This is from Croft's rifle." The pieces crashed into place. "Silas Croft," Sarah breathed. Kangisapa nodded. He explained, the story coming out in his fragmented English, pieced together with what Chotin had just told him. Chotin hadn't been wandering. He had been tracking. A week ago, Croft and his men had raided a small, isolated hunting camp. They hadn't killed anyone, but they had stolen supplies and, more importantly, a sacred object, a winter count, their family's history, a buffalo hide painted with pictographs marking the significant events of generations. It was irreplaceable, more valuable than any gold. Chotin, bold and desperate to prove his worth, had followed their tracks, hoping to retrieve it. He had gotten too close. Croft's men had spotted him near the pond and fired. "My son saw the man who shot him," Kangisapa said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "A man with a scar on his face. One of Croft's dogs." Sarah knew the man, Jesse Miller. He had a jagged scar running from his temple to his jaw, a souvenir from a bar fight in Deadwood. Suddenly, Sarah was no longer a bystander who had stumbled into someone else's trouble. She was a witness. She was harboring the victim of a crime committed by the very man who wanted to drive her from her home. The bullet hole in Chotin's shoulder and the ring of prayer fires outside were inextricably linked to Silas Croft's greed. Kangisapa looked at her, his earlier suspicion replaced by a grim, calculating assessment. He saw not an enemy, but a piece on the board he hadn't accounted for. A settler, a woman, but one who had not left his son to die. Croft will not want a witness, Kangisapa stated. It was a cold fact, not a warning. He will not want my son to speak. He will come. Sarah looked out the window at the fires. They no longer looked like a threat. They looked like the only protection she had in the world. An uneasy, unspoken alliance was being forged in the heart of the firelight, born of a crime that linked a Lakota chief, a settler widow, and a boy who had dared to fight for his past. The vigil was for Chotten, but now it was for her too. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted, the air thick with a new kind of tension. The immediate threat of violence from Kangisapa's warriors had evaporated, but it was replaced by the far more dangerous certainty of a threat from Silas Croft. The fire in the hearth crackled, a warm and domestic sound that was completely at odds with the storm that was gathering outside their tiny sanctuary. Kangisapa stood like a stone sentinel, his mind clearly working through strategies and consequences. A general planning a war on a map only he could see. Sarah, for her part, felt a strange and terrible sense of clarity. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her gut, but it was no longer a shapeless phantom. It now had a name and a face. Croft thinks this valley is his, Sarah said, her voice low. He's tried to buy me out 3 times. He doesn't like anyone who won't bend. Kangisapa grunted in agreement. He wants the land. He wants the gold he thinks is in the streams. He sees us, your people and mine, as thorns to be pulled. An unspoken truth hung between them. To men like Croft, she and the Lakota were 2 different kinds of inconvenience, but inconveniences nonetheless, to be cleared away like rocks from a field. What will you do? Sarah asked. If my son was dead, Kangisapa said, his voice flat and cold as the ice on the pond, I would have already burned Croft's ranch to the ground and taken his scalp. The chilling finality in his tone left no room for doubt. But Chotten lives. He is the proof of this crime. He looked down at his son with a fierce, protective love. I will not risk him in open battle. Not now. Justice for now had to be colder and more cunning than the simple revenge. The word of a Lakota boy against a white rancher, Sarah started, then trailed off. She knew exactly how that would play out in Redemption Gulch. The town sheriff, a paunchy, timid man named Brody, was practically on Croft's payroll. His word will mean nothing to your law, Kangisapa affirmed, his tone devoid of surprise or bitterness. It was simply a fact of the world he lived in. But the bullet, that is something different. You have the casing. We need the rifle that fired it. The plan began to form in the space between them, an idea built of shared necessity and mutual desperation. Kangisapa and his warriors could not ride into Redemption Gulch without starting a small-scale war. They would be seen as an invading force, and Croft, the attempted murderer, would somehow paint himself as the victim. But Sarah could. I can go to town, she said, the words coming out before she had fully considered their weight, their danger. Kangisapa turned his full attention to her. His eyes searched her face, gauging her resolve, her fear. You, a woman alone? Being a woman alone is how I've survived out here this long, she countered, a spark of defiance in her voice she hadn't known she possessed. They will be suspicious of you. They'll just see me as the widow O'Connell, coming in for flour and coffee. I do it every few weeks. I can go to the general store. The gunsmith. I can find a way to get a look at Croft's rifle, or get another casing from it to match. It was a wild, dangerous gamble. Croft was no fool. If he saw her asking questions, his suspicion would land on her immediately. It is a great risk, Kangisapa said. It wasn't a dismissal, but a statement of fact. Doing nothing is a greater one, Sarah replied. Like you said, he'll come for the boy, and that means he'll come through me. Chotten, who had been listening to the exchange with an intelligence that belied his age, pushed himself up on one elbow. He spoke to his father in Lakota, his voice earnest and insistent. Kangisapa listened, then nodded slowly. My son says you have an honest face, the chief translated, a hint of grudging respect in his tone. He says the spirits must have guided him to your lake. Sarah felt a flush of warmth spread through her chest, a strange feeling in the midst of all this cold fear. Tell him, tell him he is a brave boy. Kangisapa relayed the message, and Chatan gave Sarah a small, shy smile. It was the first one she had seen, and it solidified her resolve into something as hard as iron. The plan was set. At first light, Sarah would ride to Redemption Gulch. Kangisapa and a few of his warriors would remain hidden in the woods surrounding the cabin to watch over Chatan. The vigil fires would be extinguished before dawn to avoid attracting unwanted attention from any passing patrol or hunter. The rest of his people would pull back over the ridge, remaining close but out of sight. Her cabin, once a symbol of her isolation, had become the heart of a secret operation, a command post in an undeclared war. Kangisapa went to the door and gave a sharp, low whistle that mimicked a night bird. A moment later, another Lakota man, younger and leaner than the chief, slipped inside like a phantom. He carried a small leather pouch. Kangisapa spoke to him in rapid Lakota, and the man nodded, his eyes glancing at Chatan with concern, before settling on Sarah with a deep curiosity. He was introduced as Wanbli, Eagle, Kangisapa's most trusted warrior. He would be the one to remain closest to the cabin, a silent, unseen guardian. From the pouch, Kangisapa took out a poultice of crushed herbs and leaves. For the fever, he said, handing it to Sarah. Keep it on the wound. It will draw out the fire. Sarah accepted it. It was a moment of silent, practical exchange between two vastly different cultures, united by the simple, powerful need to keep a child alive. As the night deepened, an uneasy truce settled over the cabin. Kangisapa sat by the fire, sharpening a knife with a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape was a strangely calming sound, a sound of purpose. Sarah changed Chatan's dressing, applying the cool, fragrant poultice to his hot skin. The boy sighed in relief, his fevered restlessness seeming to ease almost immediately. She felt the chief's eyes on her as she worked, and she was keenly aware of the cultural chasm between them. This man's people had roamed these hills for centuries. Her people had arrived with rifles and fences, bringing laws and diseases that had shattered his world. And yet here they were, their fates intertwined by a single act of violence and a single act of mercy. Before retiring to a corner to let the chief watch over his son, Sarah looked at Liam's old Winchester. It suddenly felt clumsy, inadequate. For what she had to do in town, she needed something else. Something for close quarters, if things went sour. I need a handgun, she said aloud, more to herself than to Kangisapa. He stopped his sharpening and looked up. Without a word, he reached into the folds of his robe and produced a Colt Peacemaker, its barrel a dull blue-gray in the firelight. He laid it on the small wooden table between them, along with a handful of heavy cartridges. You know how to use this? He asked. Sarah met his gaze. Liam was a soldier before he was a farmer. He taught me. Kangisapa nodded, satisfied. He had just armed the white woman who, hours ago, he might have considered his son's captor. The alliance was sealed, not with words or promises, but with the cold, hard weight of steel. Sarah would not sleep that night. She sat in her rocking chair, the heavy pistol in her lap, watching the fire burn low. Outside, the prayer fires had been extinguished, plunging the world back into a profound, starless darkness. But she knew the warriors were still there, hidden amongst the pines, their eyes watching the cabin, their presence a silent, invisible shield. For the first time in 2 years, Sarah O'Connell was not alone, and she had never felt more in danger in her entire life. Dawn was coming, and with it, a journey into the lion's den. Dawn broke cold and gray, the sun a pale wafer behind a thick blanket of cloud. The oppressive beauty of the previous sunset was gone, replaced by a grim, washed-out light that matched Sarah's mood. True to his word, Kangisapa and his warriors were invisible. The snow bore the tracks of their arrival and the charred circles of their fires, but the men themselves had melted back into the landscape. Only Wanbli remained, a shadow she knew was watching from the tree line, an eagle on his perch. Inside, Kangisapa gave her a final look. The spirits ride with you, Sarah O'Connell, he said. The use of her full name was a mark of formal respect that felt heavy with significance. But ride faster than they do. She nodded, tucking the Colt Peacemaker into the waistband of her skirt. The cold metal was a shock against her skin. She pulled her heavy woolen cloak over it, concealing the weapon. Chatton was sleeping peacefully, his fever lessened by the herbal poultice. Looking at him, so young and so vulnerable, Sarah felt a surge of resolve that pushed back the tide of her fear. This wasn't just about her land anymore. It wasn't even just about her life. It was about justice for this boy. Her ride to Redemption Gulch was a study in tension. Every gust of wind through the pines sounded like a pursuing horse. Every shadow seemed to hold the shape of a man. She pushed her old mare, Bessie, harder than usual, her eyes scanning the trail ahead and behind. The 10 miles felt like 100. Redemption Gulch was less a town and more a wound on the landscape. A single muddy street, frozen into treacherous, rutted waves, was flanked by a dozen rough-hewn buildings. A saloon, a general store, an assayer's office, a livery, and a few shacks that passed for homes. Smoke plumed from stovepipes, mingling with the metallic scent of the nearby mining operations. Men in heavy coats and worn hats stopped and stared as she rode in. A woman riding alone was a common enough sight, but there was an intensity to Sarah's bearing that drew notice. She ignored them, swinging down from Bessie in front of Miller's General Store, the largest and most central building. The name was a bitter irony. She tethered the mare and took a moment to compose herself, smoothing her skirt, arranging her cloak. She was no longer Sarah O'Connell, ally to the Lakota. She was Mrs. O'Connell, the grieving widow, here for flour and coffee. The store's interior was dim, smelling of coffee beans, cured leather, and unwashed bodies. A half-dozen prospectors and ranch hands loitered around the pot-bellied stove, and behind the counter, polishing a glass jar with a dirty rag, was exactly who she didn't want to see. Jesse Miller, the man with the scar. His eyes, small and hard like bits of flint, flickered up as she entered. A smirk played on his thin lips. "Well now, look what the coal blew in. Mrs. O'Connell, running low on supplies for that lonely little cabin of yours?" "Jesse," Sarah said, her voice even, betraying none of the turmoil inside her. "I need flour, salt, and coffee beans." She moved through the store, gathering her items, keenly aware of his eyes on her back. The challenge was how to bring up the rifle. She couldn't just ask. It had to be natural. Her eyes scanned the shelves, past the tins of peaches and sacks of grain. In the back corner was a gun rack, a few shotguns, a couple of older model rifles, and one gleaming, brand-new Springfield trapdoor. Croft's rifle, or one just like it. As Jessie was weighing her coffee beans, she feigned a casual interest. "That's a new one," she said, nodding toward the rifle. "Haven't seen one of those up close." Jessie's smirk widened into a grin, showing brown, crooked teeth. "That's Mr. Croft's new baby, a real beauty. 45-70. Can knock a buffalo down at 500 yards, or anything else that gets in his way." He winked, a greasy, conspiratorial gesture that made Sarah's skin crawl. "I was thinking of getting a new rifle myself," Sarah lied smoothly, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Something with more power than Liam's old Winchester. The wolves have been getting bolder." This was the right bait, a damsel in distress seeking protection. Jesse's posture straightened, his chest puffing out slightly. "Well now, a lady like you needs a proper firearm. Mr. Croft's not here right now, but he keeps some ammunition. I could show you around." His words were a gift from a devil she didn't believe in. He reached under the counter and produced a single brassy cartridge, identical to the casing in her pocket. He laid it on the counter. "Feel the weight of that. That's pure stop-and power." As Sarah reached for it, her fingers trembling slightly, the bell over the door jingled. Silas Croft strode in, bringing a gust of cold air with him. He was dressed in a fine store-bought shearling coat that marked him as wealthier and more powerful than anyone else in the gulch. His eyes, a pale, cold blue, swept the room and landed on Sarah. "Miller, what's going on here?" Croft's voice was sharp, cutting. "Just showing the widow your new rifle, boss," Jesse said, suddenly less confident. "She's thinking of getting something with a bit more punch." Croft's gaze narrowed on Sarah. He walked toward the counter, his boots thudding heavily on the floorboards. He looked at her, at the rifle on the wall, and at the cartridge on the counter. His eyes were sharp, intelligent, and full of a chilling suspicion. "Is that so, Mrs. O'Connell?" he said, his voice dangerously soft. "I didn't take you for a firearms enthusiast. What sort of trouble are you expecting that your husband's rifle can't handle?" The air grew thick with unspoken meaning. This was the precipice. "A woman alone has to be prepared for all sorts of predators, Mr. Croft," Sarah replied, her voice steady as she met his icy stare. "Some four-legged, some two." A flicker of something, anger, surprise, crossed his face. He knew. He knew she wasn't just talking about wolves. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, so only she could hear. "You should have taken my offer for your land. This country swallows people like you whole, especially those who stick their noses where they don't belong." It was a clear, unmistakable threat. He suspected something. He didn't know what, but her presence here, asking about his rifle, had set off alarms in his cunning mind. Suddenly, from the back of the store, one of the loitering prospectors, drunk and emboldened, spoke up. "Heard you and your boys had some fun yesterday, Croft. Chased a little red devil off your claim up by the old pond, eh?" The entire store went silent. Jesse Miller shot the man a murderous look. Croft's face became a stony mask, but not before Sarah saw a flash of pure, unadulterated fury in his eyes. He knew. He knew she must have been there. The prospector's careless words had confirmed everything. The Lakota boy, the pond. It all pointed back to her cabin. Croft's demeanor changed in an instant. The pretense of civility vanished, replaced by cold, hard intent. "Miller," he snapped, "get her things. Her business here is done." He turned his back on her, a gesture of absolute dismissal. But Sarah knew it wasn't over. She paid for her supplies, her hands moving with a calmness she did not feel. As Jessie fumbled with her change, she subtly scooped up the cartridge he had shown her, pocketing it. It was a perfect match. She had her proof. Now she just had to live long enough to use it. As she walked out of the store, the weight of Croft's stare felt like a physical blow to her back. She untied Bessie, her fingers fumbling with the knot. She had to get back to the cabin. She had to warn Kangi Sapa. She swung into the saddle and urged Bessie into a trot, not daring to look back. But she could feel it. She could feel the hunt beginning. As she cleared the edge of town, she risked a single glance over her shoulder. Silas Croft was standing on the porch of the general store, flanked by Jesse Miller and his hulking brother Abe. He wasn't smiling. He was watching her. And then he gave a short, sharp nod to his men. They turned and strode purposefully toward the livery stable. The race was on. The ride back was a frantic, desperate flight. Sarah pushed Bessie into a gallop, the mare's lungs heaving, her hooves throwing chunks of frozen mud and snow. The gray sky seemed to press down on her, and the skeletal trees lining the trail felt like the bars of a cage closing in around her. She didn't need to look back to know they were coming. Croft and his men were hunters. They were on their home ground, and she was their prey. Every snapping twig was a gunshot. Every shadow was a rider. As she rounded the final bend that led into her valley, she saw the cabin, a tiny speck of safety in the distance, a thin plume of smoke rising from its chimney. And then she heard it, the undeniable thunder of hooves behind her, gaining fast. She urged Bessie on, the cabin growing closer, closer. She could see the edge of the woods where Wanblee and Kangisapa were hidden. She was almost there. A gunshot cracked through the air, sharp and deafeningly close. A spray of bark exploded from a tree just past her head. They weren't trying to scare her. They weren't trying to capture her. They were trying to kill her. She reached the edge of her property, throwing herself from the saddle while Bessie was still moving. She landed hard, the air knocked from her lungs, the Colt Peacemaker digging into her side. Scrambling behind a thick pine, she drew the pistol, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Croft and the two Miller brothers reined in their horses 50 yards away, fanning out, their rifles raised. "It's over, widow," Croft yelled, his voice echoing in the cold, still air. "You made your choice. Give us the boy, and we might let you live to see the sunrise." It was a lie, and they all knew it. Sarah's mind was surprisingly calm. The fear was a cold, solid thing inside her, but her hands were steady on the pistol. She was not going to die cowering. She raised the Colt, the front sight finding Croft's chest, but before she could fire, a movement from the woods to her right caught her eye. County Sapa stepped out from behind a line of aspens, his rifle held at his side. He was not alone. A dozen of his warriors materialized from the trees, silent as ghosts, their faces painted for battle, rifles and bows at the ready. The vigil fires had been a prayer. This was war. Croft's face, a mask of confident rage a moment before, twisted in shock and fury. He had walked into a trap. "So that's how it is," he snarled, raising his Springfield. "An Indian lover. You'll die with them." He leveled his rifle, not at Kangi Sapa, but at Sarah. But before he could fire, an arrow, swift and silent as death's own whisper, hissed through the air. It struck Jesse Miller in the throat. He gurgled, a look of utter surprise on his scarred face, dropping his rifle, his hands clawing at the feathered shaft as he tumbled from his horse into the snow. The world exploded in a chaos of gunfire and war cries. The valley, her quiet sanctuary, had become a battlefield. The sharp crack of Silas Croft's rifle was answered by a chorus of gunfire and the lethal hiss of arrows. Lakota warriors, moving with a spectral grace that belied the chaos, melted between the pines, their war cries sharp and unnerving, cutting through the cold air as they systematically dismantled Croft's attack. Abe Miller, Jesse's brother, shrieked as a shaft pierced his leg, pinning him to his own saddle and ending his fight before it truly began. From behind the meager cover of the pine tree, Sarah watched the maelstrom unfold. Then, a stray bullet shattered her cabin window, the sound like a physical blow. Inside was Chatton. A wave of cold, protective fury washed over her, extinguishing the last embers of her fear. This was not just Kangi Sapa's fight. Croft had brought this war to her door. She gripped the Colt Peacemaker, its weight a solid grounding presence in her hand. Across the clearing, Croft had dismounted, using his horse as a shield, firing his powerful Springfield rifle at the rocky outcrop where Kangi Sapa had taken cover. He was a skilled marksman, and the chief was pinned down. Taking a deep breath, Sarah stepped out into the open. The world seemed to narrow to the space between her and Silas Croft. He turned, his eyes widening in disbelief at the sight of the widow, armed and resolute. He swung his rifle toward her, a snarl twisting his features. But she was faster. She fired. The Peacemaker bucked hard against her palm. She squeezed the trigger again, and then a third time, emptying the pistol in a desperate, focused volley. One bullet struck true. It hit Croft in the shoulder, the same shoulder where he had shot Chatton. The impact spun him around, his own rifle discharging harmlessly into the sky. He staggered, his expression a mixture of shock and agony, before collapsing to his knees in the blood-stained snow. The battle was over as quickly as it had begun. The remaining Miller brother was swiftly captured, his fate sealed. An abrupt, profound silence fell over the valley, broken only by the wind whistling through the pines. Croft knelt, disarmed and defeated, his expensive coat soaked in his own blood. The arrogant landowner was gone, replaced by a desperate, bleeding man. Kangi Sapa emerged from behind the rocks, his face an impassive mask. He walked slowly across the snow and stopped before his vanquished foe. "This land is not yours," Kangi Sapa stated, his voice low and steady. Croft looked up, defiance warring with fear. "Savage!" he spat. As if summoned by the word, the cabin door creaked open. Chatton appeared, wrapped in a blanket, his young face pale but his eyes burning with a fierce light. He looked directly at Croft, raised his good arm and pointed. He uttered a single clear word in his own tongue. "Aya." Yes, him. The witness had spoken. The verdict was delivered. Kangi Sapa raised his rifle, and a single final shot echoed off the hills, a punctuation mark at the end of a bloody sentence. In the quiet aftermath, Sarah stood trembling, the empty pistol hanging from her hand. The smell of gunpowder was sharp and acrid in the clean, cold air. Kangi Sapa's warriors worked with grim efficiency, recovering their arrows and Croft's weapons. From Croft's saddlebag, one warrior retrieved the painted winter count and handed it to his chief. Kangi Sapa walked to Sarah. He didn't offer words of comfort or victory. Instead, he looked at her, at the smoking pistol, and at her determined face. He reached out and gently took the peacemaker from her numb fingers. "You fight for your home," he said. It was a statement of fact and profound respect. "You fight for my son." As the sun began to cast a brighter light on the grim scene, the Lakota prepared to depart. Chotten approached Sarah, his limp nearly gone. He held out the small carved wooden falcon. "For you," he said, his English soft but steady. "So you remember." Sarah closed her hand around the talisman, its smooth wood a comfort. "I will remember, Chotten." Kangisapa mounted his horse, pulling his son up behind him. He gazed down at Sarah, his expression unreadable but for the intensity in his eyes. "The debt is paid," he declared, "but the memory remains. If you need us, look to the hills. We will see." Then he turned and led his warriors into the trees, vanishing as silently as they had arrived. Sarah was left alone, the wooden falcon clutched in her hand, the rising sun illuminating a valley that was forever changed. She was no longer just the widow O'Connell. She was a woman who had found her place not in isolation, but in the crucible of a reckoning at dawn. In the heart of a merciless land, Sarah O'Connell proved that courage isn't the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it. Her story isn't just about a gunfight in the snow. It's about the bridges we build in the most unlikely of places. It's a reminder that beneath the surface of conflict and prejudice, a shared humanity can be found, sometimes in the most desperate of circumstances. The fires that once surrounded her cabin in Judgment became a circle of protection, and a lone widow became a legend in the heart of the Lakota Nation. What would you have done in her place? The choices made in a single day can echo for a generation. If this piece of hidden history moved you, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who appreciates tales of true grit. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories from the untamed heart of the past. Your support lets us keep these legends alive.